Okay, we're live, Jim.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October meeting of the UNC Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. I'm Jim Lalutis, professor of history and co-chair of the commission in partnership with Professor Patricia Parker in the Department of Communication. It's great to be back in the company of the commission members, and for others who may have joined us, we're delighted that you're here. Our first order of business is a roll call, so let me do that, please. I know we have a couple of commissioners joining us later. First, Pat Parker.
Present.
Larry Chavis.
Present.
Giselle Corby-Smith, I understand she'll be joining us in maybe 10 minutes or so. Nicholas Graham.
Here.
Ronald Harris.
Here.
Amy Locklear-Hertel.
Here.
Sherrick Hughes on leave this semester. Kenneth Jenkin.
Here.
Donna Jones. Not here. Joseph Jordan.
I'm here.
Seth Koch.
Here.
Jasmine Perez.
Here.
Ariana Avila.
Here.
Danita Horton.
Present.
Sydney Walker. And Graham Watkins. And Danita Mason-Hogans, I think I somehow missed you.
That's okay, I'm here.
Great. Well, wonderful. It's great to have everyone here. And Dolores Bailey, I'm sorry. Dolores is not with us yet. Great. Well, again, it's great to have all of you here. Let me also welcome our guest that we'll hear from later in the day, Laurie Clark and her mother, Miss Dolores Clark. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
We're really looking forward to the conversation with you. And our faculty colleague from the Department of Religious Studies, Brandon Bain. Brandon, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, our second order of business is approval of the minutes of the last meeting. I hope everyone's had a chance to review them. Are there questions, changes that need to be made, additions? If not, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
In a second?
Second.
I think we can take a visual vote. All in favor, wave or say aye if you're on the phone.
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed? All opposed?
Aye.
All right, the minutes are approved. Pat, the screen's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for opening us and welcoming our guests. Those of you who are, of course, on the commission and others who've been following our work know that we have adopted a framework for our work that emphasizes storytelling. In fact, we're applying a framework that helps us to think about narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building. When we think about narrative change, we're thinking about changing the narrative in terms of the kinds of stories that we tell about our history. The kinds of stories that, or rather who tells those stories and to what ends. Let me repeat that, it was a little rocky there. What kinds of stories do we tell about our past, about our history? Who gets to tell those stories and to what ends? Another part of our framework is, sort of an elaboration of those ends. And the productive ends for the commission's work is, those ends would include processes that allow us to heal, that allow us to repair, that allow us to reconcile, and also allow us to build relationships that will sustain an equitable and just society going forward. So those seem like lofty aims, and we are claiming them boldly that this is the work that we're doing. And our guest today will help us to start to put some, start to advance that work and give us some methodologies that advance the work. So we're going to have two very different methodologies today that will be presented on one project to illustrate how we're advancing the work that we're doing in terms of narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building. So Jim's going to introduce our first presenter who's giving us the first approach, and then I'll come back and introduce the second.
Thanks, Pat. We'll be focusing on the Barbie Family Cemetery, which is near the Rizzo Center in Meadowmont. I know everyone on the commission is aware that there's been interest and concern within the university and also within the broader Chapel Hill Carrboro community about proper curation for that space. We know that a significant number, and Brandon will tell us a bit more, provide a bit more specificity, of enslaved people are buried in that plot. The Barbies and the people they enslaved on their farm played a vitally important role in the early history of the university and this community. So it's exciting to be focusing some attention on this. We have an opportunity to work with our colleagues in the Keenan Flagler Business School and in UNC facilities to recover what has been for too long a silenced history, at least in the official narrative of the university. By researching more deeply the story of the Barbies and the enslaved people who were in part of their household. And as I say, properly and appropriately curating that space. An exciting initial project as we think about changing the narrative, as we think about reconciliation, and as we think about the ethical issues that have been in front of us with our work from the beginning. So Brandon, let me turn it over to you. Brandon is Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Religious Studies.
Yeah, just one question. Am I going to be, there we go. Someone else is going to share it for me. Okay, great. Thank you all for welcoming here to share some things that I've been working on. In the spirit of storytelling, this isn't really work that's directly connected to my research. I work on the colonial Southwest or northern New Spain in the 17th and 18th century. I work on issues of martyrdom and how it is that certain groups value some deaths and memorialize some deaths while erasing others. So in that thematic sense, it's connected, but it's even more personally connected because I live on Barbie Chapel Road. I shop in Meadowmont, and about 4 years ago, a friend of mine told me, "You know about the Barbie Cemetery, right?" And I had no idea. I had no idea about the Rizzo Center itself. And we'll go to the first slide there. I don't know if I can control. There we go. And so he took me to the Rizzo Center and to the DuBose Mansion. And, I saw the beautiful Olympic-sized swimming pool there. I saw the sports bar and accommodations of the convention center, as well as the DuBose Mansion and the beautiful furniture in there. And then we stepped behind that and we saw the foundations of the old kit Christopher Barbie farm, what's labeled there as a plantation. We'll talk about that terminology in a bit. And then we stepped in behind that and saw the Barbie Family Cemetery. And so I want to talk about that process, but I want to talk about it as a way of reflecting on the land that we occupy. The land that we inhabit and occupy and work in, at least in better times, it should be acknowledged is first land that was inhabited and worked and occupied by indigenous communities, and then claimed by white settlers, and then also lived and inhabited and worked on by Black people that those settlers exploited. And so, I want to propose, or I want to add to this conversation of recovering those stories, of the lives that have been erased. So as you all know, the Rizzo Center and the DuBose Mansion sit at the center of Meadowmont. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. They're about 3 miles east of the main campus. And if you go to the current brochures that describe the history of the Rizzo Center that I found online, they give some kind of history of this space. And what they describe are early benefactors. Early benefactors like old Kit Christopher Barbie and his son, William Barbie, who donated 221 acres of land to this university, which composed the central part of this campus, but who also occupied what was called Barbie Mountain, this farm that sits at the center of what today is Meadowmont. And I want to ask us to have a conversation about adding to that story, in addition to marking them and celebrating them as early university benefactors, to remember that they were enslavers. So if we go to the next slide, please. Now this story is not only a Barbie story, it's connected to the Keenan Flagler story itself. As is marked there on the site, Mary Lily Keenan Flagler was the great-granddaughter of Christopher Barbie. Of William Barbie, great-great-granddaughter of Christopher Barbie. She got her inheritance of land from her father, William Rand Keenan, or William Rand Buck Keenan, in the 1860s, and she sold her inheritance of land along with her husband, William Rand Keenan. I'm sorry, I mixed that up a bit. So she got her land from her mother, Mary Hargrave, who had been a Barbie, and then she sold that land with her husband, William Rand Keenan Sr., and moved to Wilmington and set up shop in Wilmington. And we know some of that story of what happens with Buck Keenan and Wilmington and his participation in the 1898 race massacre there. So this story is connected to the story of Keenan Flagler. The Keenans and Barbies are connected through Mary Lily Keenan, and through her relationship up to her mother, Mary Hargrave, who was born likely on the Barbie plantation and is the granddaughter of William Barbie. We'll go to the next slide. So that's, part of the story of Meadowmont to the east, and we'll return there. But I want to also note that the Barbies donated the central part of this campus. So I'm here in Carolina Hall today. Some of you are in South Building or work in Bynum and Hamilton Hall. All of those sit on what was the Barbie donation. That was let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Which was the oldest and largest and most central part of what we consider to be our campus today. This was 221 acres, donated in 1792 by Christopher Barbie, and it comprises most of what's now McCorkle and Polk Place. So in addition to being an early university benefactor, Christopher Old Kit Barbie enslaved, we know in 1820, 21 people, according to the slave schedules. His son, William Barbie, we know in 1850, enslaved at least 41 people. And William Barbie's son, Willis, enslaved in the same slave schedule of 1850, 13 people, including a 27-year-old woman. And I want to return to that story, but we'll mark right here under Willis Barbie, a 27-year-old female that was enslaved in 1850 by the grandson of Christopher Barbie, Willis Barbie. Between the two of them, Christopher and William Barbie likely enslaved over 100 people over the course of their lifetime. So we're only getting a snapshot in those slave schedules of the number of people that they enslaved. But I want to think about other ways that we can try to recover the stories of the people that they enslaved. So one way to do it is to look at fugitive slave ads, right? And so here's one from 1831, placed by Old Kit Barbie in the Hillsborough Recorder on July 25th. And it's an ad for a self-liberated, formerly enslaved man named Bob. It says this, that he ran away from the subscriber on the 11th. This man by the name of Bob, a very dark complexion and about 40 years old. It is probable said fellow may be lurking about Charles Macaulay's, as he has a sister there. And then goes on to say the reward to return him back to the Barbie farm in 1831. Another way of getting a glimpse of some of these lives are in the Orange County slave records. And in there, I've noted that there's 17 transactions that involve Christopher and William Barbie, giving and receiving enslaved people in business, land deals, deeds, and wills. These are now available digitally, thanks to Orange County for digitizing these and making these available. So this is something I was able to find this summer, thanks to that work. And here's just one example of the 17 transactions in those slave records. This comes from 1839, when Hudson Cave deeded to William Barbie the following. It says, doth give, grant, bargain, sell, and deliver to the said William Barbie the following property, to wit, the slaves Bill, London, Melinda, and her 3 children, James, Louisa, and Henry. Also Lucinda with her 2 children, Joe and Mary, and a boy called John. So it's another glimpse, I think, that we get of the lives of these people that lived and worked on this land. So when we talk about the Barbie plantation today, and that's the way it's still described, I think, in the Keenan Flagler literature, I want to ask us to think about the nostalgia that term invokes, the idea of a sort of old Southern charm that the word plantation is meant to invoke, and suggest that we also, or we put alongside, if not replace that term plantation with the term labor camp, right? Because that's what it was. This was a site where people were coerced into labor and given their lives and their work to serve the Barbie family. And so I call this the Barbie labor camp instead of the Barbie plantation. And I want to turn our attention to the site itself. So when it was first developed into Meadowmont, UNC conducted an archaeological survey of the land. What they found there was the DuBose mansion, and behind that, the site of Christopher Barbie's house, the foundations of it, and behind that, the Barbie family cemetery. Now at that time, that was marked as the Barbie family cemetery, and an archaeological survey was done. And so if we were to see this in a different sort of visualization here, both with an aerial photograph and an illustration, we're talking about this being the DuBose mansion, this being the site of where the original farm was, and this being the part of the Barbie cemetery that is marked right here. Over in the photograph, we're talking about this area right here. You can come to the back of it. You will see a marker that we'll look at in a second. And then you'll see a few graves that are marked and have clear descriptions on them, including William Barbie. What you don't see is everything that occupies the land running south and east from there. And so this is the main marker that you would see walking behind the DuBose house, and it says the following: contains about 120 graves on a hilltop known as Barbie Mountain, site of Barbie family plantation. Engraved headstones for William Barbie, son of Old Kit, and wife Gasky. William was a member of the House of Commons in 1819 and a merchant. One of his great granddaughters was Mary Lily Keenan Flagler. And as you walk into it, you see these marked family graves, including that of William and Gasky. I think I have a picture of that in this presentation. There we go. So that's clearly marked right by the sign, William Barbie, Gasky Barbie, with their time of death, or their date of death. What you don't see, and is only obliquely referred to in that marker, is that on this so-called plantation, there are about 120 graves. So a couple of them, as you walk out, are marked, that of William and Gasky, but the vast majority, likely over 100, are unmarked, most of which we believe, and the archaeologists who did the survey believe, were of enslaved people who worked on the Barbie labor camp. And so if you were to walk into the woods, and again, the mountain, and I think a lot of folks who have worked on these cemeteries know this, the white family members were usually built on the high spot. And as you move down into the river that ran alongside the east part of the land, you see the burials moving down into the lower spots. And as you move into those woods, you will see impressions throughout the woods, and you'll see little headstones inside of those impressions. Here's another photograph of wire that is left around an impression with a small stone. And so I want to return to, I told you earlier that in Willis, in the slave schedule of 1850, it was noted that Willis enslaved 13 people, one of whom was a 27-year-old female. Looking at the will of Willis Barbie, who died in 1869, it describes in his will that he died unmarried and he died without children. So he deeded his land to Harriet Barbie and her children, Haywood, David, and Sylvie, 100 acres of land lying on the south side of Chapel Hill and Raleigh Roads. And so, as to include my dwelling, it goes on to say it includes his farm and all of his farming equipment. What you might not know, unless you pay attention to the will itself, and then the census that follows, is that Harriet Barbie was a Black woman. And it's never fully described there what her relationship to him was, but it seems likely to conclude that she was a Black woman who was in a sexual relationship with Willis Barbie. I'm not going to describe it as a wife because it's a relationship that began in enslavement. She likely, I believe, was the 27-year-old who was enslaved by Willis Barbie in this slave schedule of 1850. And I believe that because if we go to the next slide, we see her showing up as a 47-year-old woman in Durham County census of 1870, listed as a farmer, along with her children, Haywood, David, and Sylvia, listed here. We see her show up again in 1880 in the census, this time not as the owner, the land now being farmed by her son, David, and she is keeping house. But if you track her age, right, at 47 in 1870, and then you look for a 27-year-old enslaved Black female of Willis Barbie in 1850, she shows up in his slave schedule. And so I think that's another glimpse, an important one to grab. Now, if I had, I just discovered this morning something else. If I was able to share a screen, I would show it to you. I found an old map of Durham County in 1887. And the southwestern portion of Durham County is known as Patterson Township. In Patterson Township, on the map, you see Barbie Chapel, which I'll talk about here in a second, founded in 1866. And right beside Barbie Chapel, it says H. Barbie, in parentheses, COL dot, or period, right? Noting that Harriet Barbie had her farm in 1887, so much so that she literally put herself on the map. I want to talk about two other legacies, and I think places that as we move forward and tell new stories, we might turn to. Right beside Harriet Barbie's farm in the 1880s and 1890s that she occupied was founded Barbie Chapel School, which became the prominent school for African Americans in southwestern Durham County, in Patterson Township, throughout the late 1890s and into the early 1900s. And then I mentioned before, an ongoing institution that we can still track today, Barbie Chapel, founded in 1866, still on Barbie Chapel Road, for which it was named, still functioning and thriving church that recently celebrated 150 years in 2016 as a congregation. And then I don't have a picture here, but just south of that, off of Farrington Road, we have the Barbie Chapel Cemetery, in which there are several Barbies buried, including Harriet's grandchildren, who are buried in the Barbie Chapel Cemetery just south of Farrington Road. And so I want to leave my portion here and leave some time open to answer questions that came up. But as I reflect on this, these are the stories that I think we should be turning to, are ways of finding these stories of the people that are showing up here, the self-liberated man named Bob, people like Melinda and her children who were deeded to the Barbies in the 1830s, people like Harriet Barbie who survived an enslavement and gained traction in her own farm so that she owned 100 acres south of Raleigh Road on what became Barbie Chapel Road. So thank you for your time. That's what I have.
Brandon, thank you. That was great to hear a more detailed account of your research. Questions for Brandon?
This is Giselle Corby-Smith. I'm sorry that I had to join you all a little bit later.
Great to see you.
It's good to see you all too. So first of all, thank you so much, Brandon, for that work, the research, and for sharing it with us. It was really pretty compelling. The one thing that that it brought up for me, particularly in your first comments, was the opportunity for us to have a land acknowledgement. And many universities, particularly those that are part of Ashoka U, which is around change leadership, use a land acknowledgement not only on their websites, but also before every meeting. And just to acknowledge the land on which, even virtually, which we're standing on. And I think that that may be something that we might want to consider, certainly for our website and maybe even for these meetings.
Thank you for that. I meant to, I had in my notes here to mark that this land that Christopher Barbie donated to the university was granted by the Earl of Granville in 1853. But of course, before that was occupied by indigenous Siouan and Tuscarora people, including the Occaneechi, Eno, and Shakori. And we know that there was a town in southeastern Orange County, Agashir, which was noted by Lawson in 1701 in his travels. We haven't found where that was, but it's likely this same land, right? This Occaneechi, Eno town that was noted in the early 1700s. Because of the Tuscarora Wars, we know that a lot of these groups moved during the period between 1701 and when this land was granted to the Barbies in 1753. But I think that's very, very important, and thank you for that reminder.
I'll echo that. Thank you, Giselle, and thank you, Brandon, for that that addition to your presentation. That's really a good way to sort of tell the full history as we're tasked to do here with the commission. So thank you.
I would like to thank you as well. The problem I have is that I'm too angry to say anything. I'm deeply appreciative of the work that you've put in, but I'm way too angry to say anything. Thanks.
Brandon, can I ask about, as a Native American business school professor who lives in Meadowmont, of all places, and directly, both as in some historical way hurt and in a modern way benefits from all of this, and teaches quite frequently at Meadowmont, walks my dog through Meadowmont, probably right by that, not probably, right by that cemetery. What has been the nature, and maybe others might know this, but what's been the nature of the interaction with the business school so far? Just so I can see where things are before I go stirring up any more trouble over there, and just push my colleagues to think before they start their classes, particularly in this troubled times. And we do a lot of, wow, really high value, profitable work over in the Rizzo Center, executive education, our executive MBAs. It is a luxury place where we live off the fat of the land. And we kind of have this little scam going that we don't let other parts of the university in on. So what is that? Either Brandon or others know, what's been the nature of the interaction with the business school, and is there any way I can help with that?
Yeah, Larry, thanks for that question. I should have filled this in a little more at the beginning. Pat and I have been in contact quite a bit with folks at Keenan Flagler and in facilities. And the encouraging news to report is that they are very eager to move forward with the kind of new storytelling and curation that I think we all agree is appropriate for that space. Pat and I actually asked them to pause so that the commission could take up this issue and, at some length and some depth. It was great to learn about Brandon's research so that, when that curation is done, it's done well and it's done right, that it engages people in the broader community as well as a variety of audiences, on the campus. We're talking about a history here that has been silenced and belongs to us all and ought to be recovered, in that way.
Absolutely, Jim. And I would add that, it is really a wonderful affirmation of the commission's work in terms and our principles, right, of openness and collaboration. The business school had taken the leadership on this. They brought this to us as an urgent issue. We've had lots of urgent issues brought to us. And, just to sort of reiterate what you said, that we asked them to pause and to say, this is the very kind of thing that our commission was constituted to do, is to take these kinds of untold stories and then start to do this work that I mentioned at the top of our meeting, of asking whose stories are being told, what kinds of stories are being told, and who gets to tell that story. So I think that this is very good work for our commission to really advance that work. And Joseph, I do want to acknowledge your what you shared as your emotional reaction. I've had similar deep feelings, and Brendan, I too live on Barbie Chapel Road. I don't live right on Barbie Chapel Road, but I live in a neighborhood that is adjacent to Barbie Chapel Road, and have only lived here for a couple of years. And so I just wanted to acknowledge what Joseph brought to our attention of engaging with these stories. And for me, I'm engaging with it almost every day as I reflect on the history of the place that I'm inhabiting right now. So this is good work for us to do, important work. And so we want to move forward. And if I may, I want to transition to our next approach. Sorry, Seth, please, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll try to be brief. Thank you so much, Brandon, for this presentation. I wanted to maybe bookmark for a future conversation or an email, a conversation about your research methods, particularly ways that maybe we can emulate with students that could help them sort of uncover and build on this work. I also wanted to put on the table the Purefoy Cemetery that's in Southern Village, where there are people who are described as servants buried. And I don't know if that's a euphemism. I expect it is, but I just don't know a lot about it. And it's a cemetery that was designated as abandoned when Southern Village was built. So the developers had no responsibility to keep it up. So there's basically headstones that are in the woods. And I think that to the extent that our commission is responsible not just for intimately UNC connected people, but also our community at large, Chapel Hill community, maybe there's a way we can draw that cemetery and some work in around that as well.
I'll just note as well that the Mason and Morgan farms, which today are Finley Golf Course and part of the Botanical Gardens and the Mason Farm Preserve as well, were labor camps. And I don't think there's been archaeological work done, but we know right behind the golf course clubhouse is the Mason Morgan cemetery, the family cemetery, again on the hill. And my suspicion is as you move down towards Morgan Creek, if work were to be done, you would find the same pattern that we see on the Barbie plantation in Meadowmont.
And I really appreciate that framing, by the way, of labor camps. You know, I teach a lot about Southern history, and one of the transitions that I teach about is the way in which plantations, I'm guilty of using that word, and I'm going to change my language now. Plantations evolved into prison farms and other, carceral spaces, quite literally, and sometimes ironically enough, such as the case of Caledonia Farm, were segregated white prison places after being places that enslaved African Americans. Anyway, thank you again.
I actually was going to say the same thing, that I'm about to change my language, but I'm also thinking that maybe we figure a way to make that broader on campus as part of the way that we talk about our work and how we want to redefine the terms.
Nomenclature really matters, profoundly so. We'll need to close out here and move ahead. But Brandon, if I may, I'm going to volunteer you. Folks have follow-up questions they'd like to ask. And just one last thing, thinking about this space and the appropriate curation, I know I've shared with Pat and some others. Nick, I think you were at the UVA University Studying Slavery conference when there was an evening ceremony reconsecrating a cemetery of this type in Charlottesville. I have to say it's one of the most moving events I've attended in a long, long time. So as Pat said, there are lots of opportunities here for us to move forward in ways that are meaningful.
Yes, for sure. So now we want to turn our attention to our second methodology that advances our work in terms of changing the narrative, narrative change, racial healing, and relationship building. And to do that, I am going to turn it over to one of our commission members, Danita Mason-Hogans, Danita Mason-Hogans, said it right the first time, who is going to tell us about an approach that is called the critical oral history approach. Danita, please.
Thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate that. I'd like to begin, if I could, with by offering gratitude first to Chancellor Guskowicz for asking me to be a part of this commission. Second, to Jim and Pat for their excellent leadership. And I also would like to thank the commission members for always inspiring me with the work that you do. Thank you so much, Brandon, for your presentation. Those of us from Chapel Hill know that there are enslaved cemeteries scattered all over Chapel Hill, and we really appreciate you taking the time to acknowledge that and doing that work. And lastly, of course, I wanted to thank the Clark family, my cousins, Dolores, who is the daughter of Hannah, and Laura, who's the daughter of Dolores, for underscoring why collecting these narratives is so important. So what I wanted to share with you today is the critical oral histories component that we developed with the veterans from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and just give you like a little bit of backstory and tell you how that process evolved. So most people only have like a cursory knowledge about SNCC and only think of them as just a group of young people who were involved with the civil rights movement. But most of SNCC's accomplishments were not as widely known nor shared. For instance, in 1960, these young people were brought together by one of the most brilliant political minds this country has ever seen, and her name was Ella Baker. These students went to the heart of the most violent, dangerous, deeply rooted, segregated places in America. And in just 8 short years, they changed the whole course of political power for Black people before most of them were even 25 years old, with fortitude and with nonviolence. So it was SNCC who coined the phrase Black Power, and they were talking about voting power. SNCC activists created models of engaging the community that are long-lasting and are presently used by both political power parties by working with local communities on the grassroots level and rose Black voter registration in the Black Belt South from 4 registered voters in one area to 55,000. SNCC's work in Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, really changed the whole political landscape and were largely the reason that people wanted to develop a new Southern strategy. SNCC tied the attainment of political power to education and started the Freedom Schools in the South for undereducated Black youth. SNCC also led the effort against Black participation in the Vietnam War and heavily inspired the women's movement. In addition, SNCC highlighted the legendary leadership of such people as John Lewis, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Bob Moses. In fact, 5 members of SNCC were actually the recipients of the MacArthur Genius Award. So I want to reiterate that all of this happened in just about 8 short years. And most of them, as I said before, were under 25 years old. So they took on this system of systemic inequality with fortitude and nonviolence. And it was young people who were leading that movement then, and it is young people who are leading the movement now. In January of this year, I had the privilege of presenting at the American Historical Association on SNCC. And then I got into a conversation with movement scholar, Dr. P. Neal Joseph. And he said that we really only have recently begun to conduct serious study of the civil rights movement, and that a great deal has been glossed over or not studied. And what he said was true. As scholar Wesley Hogan states, people's understanding of what's important in history is driven more by what is left out than by biased history writing, filmmaking, or museum curation. This is true not only for public history's consumers, but for curators, filmmakers, and historians. We only make films, exhibits, and books about what we can find evidence of, and what we find through archives and oral histories, museum collections, and big data. So sometimes what this means is there's a massive loss of information. This became clear to one of my mentors, Charlie Carr, a member of SNCC, when he was helping Bob Moses to write the book Radical Equations. And he ran into some young people who thought that Fannie Lou Hamer existed in ancient times and had no idea what SNCC stood for. So at the SNCC 50th anniversary convening, he and other SNCC veterans embarked on a process to share their story from the bottom up and from the inside out. The thing is, these brilliant people were also movement people who understood that so much in this society rests on power. And I had a transformative conversation with Courtney Cox, who is the chair of the SNCC Legacy Project, about documenting history. And he said to me, Danita, we have to realize that most Black people don't and didn't have the money to provide huge donations to a university and to get an archival box of papers about their work. What we do have, though, is informational and informational wealth that we can bring to tell and document our own stories. And that's what they did. So the SNCC veterans went to various universities, UNC was one of them, and wanted to enter into a different type of relationship that centered the knowledge and experience of key decision makers of their history. The SNCC veterans realized that they could offer critical insight into the civil rights movement and presented a radical deviation from institutional norms, that they were the actual experts on civil rights history, and therefore would only enter into a co-equal partnership with the universities who were studying them. So that is how we got started on the SNCC Digital Gateway. So Wesley Hogan, again, comments that working to center the perspective of the activists themselves was a major point of departure, transitioning from the traditional university norms of interaction to a more equitable one that explicitly acknowledged that expertise does not only come from the university. In fact, the collaboration's goals were to change the normative story of the civil rights movement to tell the story of SNCC's organizing from the bottom up, but also from the inside out, exploring how affected people organized to change history, while also making SNCC materials more widely accessible to our primary audiences, students, teachers, activists, cultural workers, and citizens. At the urging of scholar activists and the SNCC Legacy Project board members, Jerry Augusto and Charlie Cobb, SNCC veterans in the SNCC Legacy Project determined that the critical oral history methodology, which was first developed by James Blight and Janet Lang to study the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, might be adapted to study SNCC's legacy. The Center for Documentary Studies agreed that the critical oral histories methodology was a way to develop a richer, more complex set of questions to ask, with the possibility of generating a far more nuanced body of evidence about critical unanswered questions. So it would be a telling not of a monolithic, unreflective story, but rather one of many voices in retrospect. As one SNCC veteran had noted, most of the stories important to understanding SNCC and its legacy had not yet been told. So our goal was to develop the methodology of the critical oral histories to elicit from SNCC veterans a new wealth of information that allowed a clearer understanding of how SNCC activists engaged and resolved the tensions that inevitably developed as they fought for freedom. What made it possible for them to transform an entire region captive to white supremacy and strive to make it into a model of citizen democracy? What if a way were found, another SNCC veteran asked, to reflect in carefully put together small groups the thinking, concepts, and strategies pursued by SNCC? So in short, our goal was to understand better, discover, and explain just how multi-layered and complex the activism of the 1960s era really was. So the first slide you see is in 2015. And I was the coordinator at that time of the One Person, One Vote conference at Duke. And we convened about 200 scholars, policymakers, veteran activists from all over the country to explore voting rights. So thank you for the second slide. From that conference, a dialogue developed between the young activists and the veteran activists about questions and the history and of the organizing methodology of SNCC. And in 2016, we held our first conference on the roots of Black power. Thank you for the third slide. So here are the components of the critical oral history that we worked to develop for the conference. So as you see, we have principal participants. These are people who were the key decision maker, the principal decision makers. We have community members. These are people who were connected to the historical event or who saw it happen. Facilitators, people who are knowledgeable about the event and are skilled at facilitating group discussion. And that's important. People have to have knowledge about the idea. Scholars, these are people who have researched and written about the incident and have extensive knowledge, which will help provide context and missing pieces of the event. And then it was important to the SNCC folks to have youth participants. And these are 3 to 5 young people, some people can do more or less, who will be able to observe and ask questions at the end of each session about the event and its historic significance. We also have adjacent actors. These are the people from places or institutions who, which may have been adjacently involved with an incident, such as you may have a journalist or someone from the police department or the hospital, et cetera. Then you also have the archives, have to develop the archives, and that's the principal participants will offer guidance. So we're centering the people who made the history as to what might be important areas to research. This will result in an extensive database with primary source documents, articles, and relevant content for future research. So in this case, we produced a dossier of maybe about 200, 250 documents to pull from. Then we also have video and audio recorders. The production of an archival video and transcript will be developed later with the assistance of the archive for future documentation and research. The dossier itself will then be sculpted down to a 12 to 15 page dossier of research to be reviewed for the basis of discussion. And that's for the participants who will participate in the critical oral histories component. So we don't want to inundate them with hundreds of documents. We whittled it down to a few that will be evocative so that they can remember certain events. Then we also have the researchers, and those are the teams that ideally consist of community members, scholars, and students to contribute to the research database and sensory items from the critical oral histories session. Okay, so these are the steps and the timeline that we developed for the critical oral history component. First, our objective is a curated archive, a dossier of primary documents, images, and even sounds prepared well in advance. So when you take steps 1, 2, and 3, that's part of that process. And then secondly, a fairly small group of movement veterans with firsthand participation in the main events, concepts, or turning points are discussed. And then you get with the adjacent actors or the smaller set of actors, allies and opponents during that time period under consideration, whose memories and viewpoints can offer useful counterparts. So the result of this, and thank you for the 6th slide, is a sample of the agenda that we used for the critical oral history component on Black Power. And so you can see some of the people that we invited to have conversation with and talk about the critical oral histories component. So the final slide is, it's important to know, I think we need one more slide. Okay. For the final slide, I'd like to say that our work together, we relied on the memories and artifacts of the people who were there to share their history and use their experiences to direct us to primary source documents and information from that time period. We sought to have a true partnership and gave equal authority to the institution, the archivists, and the participants of the history. And what resulted from this type of collaboration is a transparent and intentionally inclusive process. And what we were able to get was a collection of new historical information, which enhances the whole narrative of the civil rights movement. And it also provided an opportunity to offer clarity and correction to the popular narrative of how things occurred and why they occurred. The way in which we choose to remember history reflects the values of the people in power. So I think that it's always important to be reminded of what people in power choose to uphold. There is a great interest today in history, and we are in the way of, as Pat Parker said earlier, establishing new ways of documenting Southern narratives, with the South as the center of the noble story, including boxes and debates that also have had such a firm hand on how we understand and perceive power in the South, and how that history was taught on campus. So historically, I think it would be helpful to think of the exclusionary narrative of UNC power holders, such as Kemp Plummer Battle, and how they used historical narratives to shape the policies for wealth and education, which remain with us today, and how we can use this form of scholarship to create a more equitable way of telling and documenting history, and using institutional wealth to uncover stories that are relevant to justice. So I would be happy to entertain any questions that we might have. I would also like to add that we have used the model for what we developed at the SNCC Digital Gateway to inform our work on the Civil Rights Task Force for the town of Chapel Hill, and with our collaboration with the Chapel Hill Public Library, and are engaging in work currently now to explore things like what happened with James Cates in Chapel Hill. So the way that we are engaging in this work is very, very important. And I'm so pleased to be able to share this with you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time. I think I went over my time a little bit.
I think we have a couple of minutes for questions before we move to the Clarks.
Okay.
Any questions?
Danita, that was fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing that approach. And my question is around the way how far back does the history need to go? So this past 7 months has, some might say we're on the sort of cusp of a new civil rights movement. And is there a space for us to sort of capture the recent past as well as the more distant past as sort of a continuous and evolving narrative of that where we can shape what that narrative is.
I mean, that's such an excellent that's such an excellent observation and insight, and it kind of leads me to once we had developed worked to develop the SNCC Digital Gateway. What we found with the young folks that we were interacting with is that there does need to be documentation right now of how these young people moved. So what we're in the process of developing is a SNCC Digital Gateway Point 2. And what that does is it invites people who were a part of Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, Dream Defenders, and we're engaging in a process to capture those very critical narratives. And I mean, what you said was so on point because history really exists on a continuum. So the civil rights movement was not the first part of resistance in this country. I think what's new is the recognition and the realization and the methodology that, you know, specifically when it comes to resisting oppression, there are methods that people can use and look back on and document. And so the importance of capturing these narratives has really been highlighted. So thank you so much for that question.
All right, I think with that, we probably need to move on to the next part of the program. And Danita, you will still hold the mic there because I will ask you to reintroduce our guests and you know, sort of frame their conversation so that they can move forward with their presentation.
Well, I'm so happy to introduce my cousins and members of the Clark family. Lori Clark is one of our preeminent movement people in Chapel Hill. She has been working with youth in Chapel Hill for about 30 years. She's brilliant. She works with cultural arts currently and has been such a huge part of youth and leadership development in Chapel Hill. She's also the daughter of Miss Dolores, who is our town treasurer and our queen in Chapel Hill. And when we are collecting history and doing historical work, I go to Miss Dolores because really and truly she is one of the premier sources of information on Chapel Hill local history. And I also consider her a local archivist because she had a lot of documentation about the things that have happened at Chapel Hill. So for me, Mrs. Clark and the Clark family are examples of how this campus community collaboration really needs to take place, because I guarantee you the Clark family has so much, such a wealth of history that we could all pull from to gain a better understanding about local history in Chapel Hill. So I'm going to be quiet so they can enjoy you, and I'm going to turn it over to the Clark ladies.
Thank you, Danita. And thank you all so much for allowing us to share this space with you today. So I'd like to thank Brandon for the extensive information he provided about the Barbie family. And so the way that we are connected is through Harriet Barbie, who had a son named Dave, and Dave had Fred Barbie, who married Sally Strayhorn. We are 7 generations of Barbie heirs in Carrboro. And so what I'd like to share is how we ended up from Barbie's Chapel in Carrboro. And so when Willis died, he had a will. And so and I'll just read this to you if you don't mind. Um, in 1900, David and Rachel are a family of sorts. Harriet would have been 80, and I'm talking about Harriet, who was enslaved and had children by Willis. And so Fred was David's son. Fred married Sally Strayhorn, and they ended up moving to the west end of Chapel Hill, which is now Carborough. And they had a farm. And so my great grandparents were Tony and Nellie Strayhorn, and my mom will talk a little bit about them. And Fred ended up marrying Sally, and they again lived here. So when Harriet died between 1800 and 1900, 1880 and 1900, the land went to David and Rachel. And when Rachel died, the land was left to David. David died around 1935. My great grandfather Fred had already been deceased, and in that land, his share went to Norman Barbie, who was David's last surviving son. Norman did not have any children, and so the land passed to Fred's children, and my grandmother was one of Fred's children. And so they ended up inheriting all of the land, which is now Barbie's Chapel Road, right along Barbie's Chapel. And from what I understand, at that time, it was a total of 42 acres that went to the Barbie heirs. And so Fred ends up marrying Sally Strayhorn, and they end up having 10 children. And my great grandfather, Tony Strayhorn, was a slave, ended up here in Chapel Hill. He came from University Station. His mother was a slave and sold when he was 8 years old in Hillsborough. He never saw his mother again, but ended up growing up, being raised in University Station, and then moved to Carborough, met his wife, Nellie Atwater, and they ended up having 2 children. And so I'll let my mom talk a little bit about Tony and Nellie, and then we can talk more about Fred and Sally and their children and the work that the Barbies have contributed to Chapel Hill and Carborough.
So I'm going to talk about Tony Strayhorn and Nellie Atwater Strayhorn. They were born right here in Orange County in 1850, the same year, and they grew up during the Civil War area. They were both slaves, and they were owned by slave masters. Nellie was on plantation about 6 miles from Chapel Hill, right past the University Lake. And Tony, as my daughter said, lived around the University Station area. So in 1865, you know that the slaves were freed. So they met after a few years, and they married on January 27th, 1876. So in order to save money to buy land after they married, they went without shoes and sold vegetables because they had a farm and sold vegetables in the community. But then they purchased a small piece of land, more land, and cleared the area of forests where they built a log cabin, one room that they slept, ate, cooked, and did everything in that one room until they were able to make additions. So after starting a family, they expanded the one room into a farmhouse. And it was built in 1879. House is still standing now, and I live there. 7 generations that if you can see on the screen, a picture of the home and my great grandfather standing on the porch on a straight on. To the right is my great grandmother, Nella Strayhorn, the ones that purchased the land. And the other people you see are my grandmother and a great aunt, and then my mother's siblings and my uncles and other family members in front of the house. And so I still live there now. I'm still trying to hold on to the house. Passed on down through generations. My great, excuse me, my great grandparents and Nellie, hard work. They had 30 acres of land right here in Concord, and they farmed, and we had all everything on the farm that that you know for that so that we could eat. They also had raised things that my great grandmother sold in the community. She did sold milk and butter in the community and vegetables, and so they were really hard workers, but they thrived. And if they thrive, I have so much faith in God. So, like I said, it's been 7 generations that have lived in this home. Now, I continue to live there because I was raised in the home. But my great grandparents were really pillars in the community, and my great grandfather, like my daughter said, his mother was sold when he was 7 years old. And so he had a really hard life, but still continued to be on the plantation, which is a Strayhorn plantation right here in Orange County. And so they not know how to read or write, of course. Back then they weren't taught, but my great grandfather Tony, that on the back porch of the home, and he taught himself to read by moonlight. So he was able to become a minister. He became a magistrate. He was one of the founders of the First Baptist Church in Chapel Hill. And he went on, was a musical choir director, just a very important man in the community, and also my great grandmother also. So anyway, I have a lot of history, and I'm going to let my daughter talk a little bit more about it.
So Tony and Nellie had 2 children, William Strayhorn and Sally Strayhorn. William was a brick mason. He ended up building a house. We live on Jones Ferry Road. Like my mom said, we still live in the home place, which was built back in the late 1850s. So my grandfather purchased 30 acres of land. And so William ends up building a house next door to the home place. And Sally and Fred Barbie end up building a home just a few feet from where we are now. And so Sally and Fred Barbie end up having 10 children. And they end up dying very early. And so 2 of the children end up coming to help my great-great-grandparents live and tend to the farm. And the other children remain in the Barbie home place that's also, again, on Jones Ferry Road, raising themselves. And as my mom alluded to, they were very resourceful. We had a farm on the acreage here. My uncles, many of you may have heard their names, Willis Barbie, Alfred Barbie. They were brick masons, and a lot of the brickwork that you see on UNC's campus on Franklin Street, they did the masonry work, built a lot of buildings. And so we are very proud of our legacy and the work that our ancestors have and the contributions that they've made to this community. And so I'll stop here. We can go to the next slide. So this is not, this was the best that I could do under the circumstances. But the photo in the front is of my great-great-grandfather. He was a Mason. The photo on the left is a photo of my grandmother and her sisters. A couple of them left the South, as many people did, in search of a better life. And so several of them ended up moving to New York, New Jersey, to work and to find a profession that could be lucrative. And in the back is my great-great-grandmother, Nellie Strayhorn. And to the right is my beloved grandmother, Ruth Stroud. And I'll pause here to see if anyone has any questions before we move on.
I have a question, Lori. So, Ms. Dolores, you have collected so much history over the years.
Yes.
And I would just like to know, and you still live in the same house that your enslaved ancestors lived in. Ms.
Yeah.
Dolores, why is it so important for you to collect this history? And what began your course in claiming these stories?
Well, it's important because I'm just honored to be a part of this legacy. And I understanding that my great grandparents, they worked so hard to preserve this land that they purchased and passed on to generations. And I'm just, I was raised in that home, which I still live there now after all years of after I got married and built my own home. But then when my husband passed away and my mother passed away and everybody, I decided to, move back in the home and try to preserve it myself. So that's what I'm trying to do now. And it's been hard, but we're surviving because I love it. And I wouldn't take nothing. I wouldn't have no other place for that particular house that I'm in right now. It's just, I just love living there.
Well, I know you have a whole lot of connections to UNC, and you personally have some connections in healthcare. Could you talk a little bit about that, Ms. Dolores?
In healthcare,
Yes, ma'am.
well, UNC, I worked at UNC as a nurse for years, and then I worked with 4 doctors in the community, Chapel Pediatrics for a long, long time. Then I moved away for a short period, and we're still continuing to work for an organization, HMO. And then when I came back, as I was in the Chapel Hill office, we took care of a lot of children, in Chapel in the area. And and in the evening, we provided services for children who didn't, have resources or money to really get medical care. So a doctor, one of the doctors that I work with, Dr. Charles Schaefer, who has passed away, we organized and made it possible for children to come to a free clinic once every week where we provided services for all the community children who were unable to take the parents to take care of the children as far as medical conditions were concerned, So we did that for a long, long time in the community, providing services. And I still see a lot of those children to this day, have grown up and appreciate the service that was given.
Well, I'm gonna ask you one more question before we open it up to the rest of my commissioners. I just wanted to ask you, what role do you think that oral history should play in talking about the relationship between UNC and some of the families like yours and mine, in terms of like the history and how our relationship has been with the UNC over these many, many years?
Oh, I think it is so important. And I just wish more people, would learn about their families and just get the history. I love history. And every time I see something interesting about history, I'm reading it. So I think it's important for family and the community to really remember the sacrifices of their family history is important. So they can be passed on down from generation to generation. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm writing my story along with trying to keep the history of my great grandparents so that it would be passed on down to generation. And I think it's important. And today, a lot of people, they're not getting the history that's so important to families. And I wish that more families would just really think about that and just get the history together. And it's interesting if you have the history and you can sit down and everybody, you can explain what happened back when you were growing up, or it's important. It's just important.
Well,
And
Mr.
so,
Lewis, do you think,
Danita,
what'd you say?
I'll just add a little to that. I think, as my mom said, that it's very important because people don't know. And when you don't know, you can't preserve your history and your legacy. And I don't think that people know about the contributions of African Americans in Chapel Hill at the university. I mean, who would ever know that the rock wall was around UNC was built by by Black men in the community, right? If you don't highlight that, who would know that they were the architects of some of the buildings that are on campus? And so I think oral history is very important. I did a workshop with a group of students teaching them about the Chapel Hill Nine. So if we don't get this information out and it's not preserved, of course, then it'll be lost. So I, commend, the commission for what you're doing and trying to preserve. And I hope that you get the funding to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Lawrence?
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, ma'am.
Also, when you have Thanksgiving gatherings at Christmas time and you sit down with family, you can find out, just ask questions, and bring things together and let them, and that's how you learn. So I think that's very important, for families to find out, how they were brought up or how they were raised. And it's very important.
Well, I appreciate so much both of y'all sharing not only history, but what you continue to do for the community. Now, Ms. Dolores, are you gonna think I'm rude if I ask you to share how old you are?
I am 86, almost 87.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. So I would like to open it up now. Is it all right to stop sharing, Lori?
I was going to ask them to go to the next slide. I want them to see this. So this is the house as it stands today. We are on the North Carolina registry. My mom has gone to great lengths to try and preserve it. And if you look at the front window on the right is where the one-room log cabin was originally built. And thank God that my grandmother used to share stories with us. And so she said that, of course, her grandparents didn't want to get electricity. And so she ended up having it wired upstairs in her room. And so when they realized that there was light, they encouraged her to put electricity throughout the entire house. But each room tells a story in this house. And so one room became 4 rooms, became 6 to 10 rooms. And so I'm proud. I live in the house I grew up in, which is next door to this house. And so I'm happy to be able to share my story, our story with the community.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, ma'am.
Since you just mentioned the room, the first room was built out of logs. And it's just, I call that my fancy room because it's, I just love that room because I slept in it so much when I was growing up, and I love that room. So I call it my fancy room. And the reason I call it my fancy room is because behind those walls, there is so much love.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lawrence. I don't want to hog your time. I have plenty of other questions to ask you, but I can ask you at another time. I want to share and allow other commissioners to ask questions if you have any for Either Miss Dolores or Lori.
Can I ask a quick question and also a quick comment? First, I'll just say thank you very much, especially Ms. Dolores, for joining us. And it gives me hope seeing that your family has made it through all this, that maybe my family can make it through 2020. Yeah, so I didn't have a lot of that this morning, but I have more now. It does make me a little sad with COVID. I wish I could just go over and sit with you on that porch. I would, of course, bring some tea and flowers, and hopefully one day I can do that. And it reminds me that, you know, we come to, those of us from other places in North Carolina come to Chapel Hill and just assume that there's just a university and nothing else. And this is stories, this just like I would hear at home in Robinson County. So this is very moving for me. Lori, if I could just ask you, I saw the Hannah Ruth Foundation and I just visited the website really quickly. I'm gonna, as soon as I can log into PayPal, I will make a donation just to thank you all for your visit. But could you talk a little bit more about that and how that fits in with your story?
Sure. So the Hannah Ruth Foundation is named after my paternal and maternal grandmothers. I love my grandmother Ruth so much. She taught me a lot about civic engagement. And I think I am the person I am today because of her wisdom and knowledge and guidance. And so after Hurricane Katrina hit, I got a group of my friends together to talk about how we could support families in New Orleans. And then we decided that charity begins at home and that we needed to be able to do some things for people that live here in Orange County. And so with my mom as my inspiration, we started the Hannah Ruth Foundation to meet some of the needs of elderly people really initially, because a lot of Black people live on Social Security and can't take advantage of some things that they would like to be privy to or experience. And so we decided to start the Hannah Ruth Foundation to support our elders in the community, to honor them. Since then, we've moved to a more intergenerational model of working with youth to bridge this gap. And so our youth, you know, partner with our elders to do a number of, you know, events and volunteer projects so that elders can share information and young people can learn, and so that we never lose our history, and there's that connection of the intergenerational model.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question? Thank you for that. You know I'm moving, Lori. Now I'm madder at you than I ever was, because Lori and I used to work together, and she only mentioned once all of this information and history. So I'm forgiving the $5. I'll let you know that. But I wanted to ask, have you all put the house or tried to get it entered on any historic registers or anything like that?
So it is listed on North Carolina Registry. At one point, we had started working on the National Registry, and we just have not pursued it.
Yeah.
It is a lot of work.
Yeah. That might be part of a project, to tell the truth. Yeah, that we can think about.
I think my mom would love that if it ended up on the National Registry.
And
I actually have a
think
former graduate student who's done that kind of work for years. So if
and you got students, I think Seth mentioned students as, you know, this would be a wonderful learning opportunity to work with that grad student, Joe, to understand how to do that.
This is Giselle. That was actually my question. Lori and Miss Dolores and Miss Clark, thank you so much for being here with us today. It just increases my my fondness and warmth for both of you. My question really was about other homes that you know of that and other families that we might need to connect with to hear from to include in this work.
So there are a few, you know, not many are left in Chapel Hill, Carborough. And and I would have to think about it, but I know in Carborough, there's the Mason Home Place, not far from Piedmont Health, that should be preserved, and the Mason family still lives there. I just have to give that some thought. And Danita could probably help us think about some of the communities, like Miss Wilson on Church Street. Her house should be preserved. And again, so if you think about gentrification, there are not a lot of Black people left that have been here, 2 to 3 generations. But we can definitely think about that and would be happy to provide a list to the committee.
Thank you.
I think that would be wonderful. And unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. I want us to wrap up, but wrapping up in a way that honors the wonderful, rich conversation that Mrs. Clark, thank you so much, and Lori, thank you for being here, and Brandon Bain. And so our subcommittees then will continue this conversation, and I appreciate the questions that the commissioners have raised that kind of sparks part of the work that we're going to be doing going forward. So with that, I think that we can have a motion to conclude our meeting today, again with thanks to our guests and to the commissioners. Thank each of you. I'm just looking at all the wonderful participants that are here, the members of our commission, and we look forward to seeing you in our subcommittee meetings in the coming weeks.
All right,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Loris and
Thank you so
Brandon.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
so much.
Have a great day.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.